There is an unspoken assumption we make every time we walk down a city street. We assume that the pavement beneath our boots is the true and final surface of the earth. We believe that the foundation of the building next to us rests upon solid ground, planted firmly into the bedrock of history. We accept the world exactly as it is presented to our eyes. But history is not always a solid thing. Sometimes history is a physical layer, quietly poured over the truth to hide a past that was too difficult, too chaotic, or too terrifying to remember. If you travel to the heart of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and stand on the bustling corners of its historic downtown, you will see a vibrant, thoroughly American city. You will see grand brick facades, heavy iron lampposts, and paved roads carrying the endless hum of modern traffic. It feels permanent. It feels grounded. But if you were to take a heavy iron pickaxe, step off the curb, and violently tear through the asphalt, you would not just find dirt. If you dug down exactly 12 feet, your shovel would strike something hollow. You would break through a barrier, shine a lantern into the suffocating darkness, and find yourself staring at a perfectly intact glass window. You would see a wooden door with a brass handle locked from the outside. You would see the brick archway of a 19th century storefront, suspended in eternal midnight. The street you were just standing on is not the ground. It is a roof. And the story of how an entire, fully functioning city was quietly buried alive under millions of tons of earth is one of the greatest, most poorly documented architectural anomalies in the history of the United States. To understand the sheer, terrifying scale of what lies beneath Chattanooga, we have to look at the process of discovery. For generations, the buried city was not a matter of public record. It was a localized urban legend, a strange rumor whispered by plumbers, utility workers, and basement renovators. The story always started the same way. A utility crew would be dispatched to fix a deep water main, or a demolition team would be hired to clear the foundation of an old Victorian building. They would bring in their heavy equipment, cutting deep into the soil. Suddenly, the earth would give way. A worker would be lowered into the trench, expecting to find roots and bedrock. Instead, his light would sweep across a subterranean void. He would find himself standing on a cobblestone street. He would look up and see the modern street level acting as a ceiling held up by massive, deteriorating brick arches. He would look around and see an entire city block, storefronts with the original paint still peeling from the wood, heavy iron hitching posts, 4 horses, and limestone thresholds worn down by thousands of footsteps from a forgotten era. It was not a basement, it was a first floor. It was the original city, sitting silently in the dark, 12 to 15 feet below the sun. When these discoveries began to happen with alarming frequency in the latter half of the 20th century, the public demanded answers. How does a city lose its first floor? How do entire blocks of commercial real estate end up buried underground without anyone remembering it happening? The official explanation was quickly produced by local historians and municipal archivists. It is an explanation born of natural disaster, and on the surface it seems to make perfect logical sense. The story goes back to the spring of 1867. Chattanooga was a vital, growing hub of industry and transportation, nestled in a deep valley surrounded by mountains. But its greatest asset, the winding, powerful Tennessee River, was also its greatest existential threat. In March of that year, the skies opened up. The rain did not stop for days. The heavy winter snowpack in the mountains melted simultaneously, sending a catastrophic wall of water rushing down into the valley. The Tennessee River swelled to monstrous proportions. It broke its banks and consumed the city. The water rose to an incredible 58 feet above its normal level. It was an apocalyptic event. The downtown district was entirely submerged. People were trapped on the roofs of their homes, watching the bodies of livestock, ruined wagons, and entire houses float down the raging currents of Market Street. When the water finally receded weeks later, it left behind a city coated in thick, foul-smelling mud. The devastation was absolute. According to the official historical narrative, the civic leaders of Chattanooga made a radical, desperate decision. They decided that they could not live at the mercy of the river any longer. If the river was going to rise, the city had to rise above it. The city council allegedly drafted a massive engineering plan to raise the grade of the entire downtown district by an average of 12 to 15 feet. The plan, as described by the official record, was to bring in millions of cubic yards of fill dirt. They would dump this dirt directly into the streets, packing it down until the road level was even with the second-story windows of the existing buildings. The property owners were then told to adapt. The original first floors, once bustling with sunlight and commerce, would become basements. The second-story windows would be knocked out and replaced with front doors. The sidewalks would be rebuilt suspended in the air, creating a new artificial ground level. It is a fascinating, heroic story of American ingenuity. It is a story of a city fighting back against nature and winning. But when you strip away the legend, when you look past the neat packaged summary provided by the historical societies, and you actually dive into the archives, the narrative begins to crack. The details begin to blur, and the logistics of the official explanation become deeply, profoundly unsettling. Let us examine the physical reality of raising a city in the late 19th century. This was not an era of massive diesel excavators, hydraulic dump trucks, or centralized, federally funded infrastructure projects. This was the 1870s and 1880s. Earth was moved by men with iron shovels, pushing wooden wheelbarrows, and driving horse-drawn wagons. To raise dozens of city blocks by 15 feet requires an almost unimaginable volume of material. We are talking about millions of tons of earth, rock, and clay. Where did this material come from? You cannot simply scoop up the surrounding farmland without utterly destroying the local agricultural economy. You must quarry it, transport it, and compact it. The logistics would have required a highly organized, heavily funded, and meticulously documented municipal operation. There should be thousands of pages of city ledgers detailing the purchase of the dirt. There should be massive tax levies passed to fund the armies of laborers required to move it. There should be detailed engineering blueprints filed in the county courthouse showing exactly how the massive retaining walls were to be built. But when investigators look for these central unifying documents, they find a chilling bureaucratic silence. There is no master plan. There is no single massive city ordinance ordering the raising of Chattanooga. The records that do exist are fractured, piecemeal, and strangely vague. There are minor mentions of street grading, small requests for local retaining walls, and localized individual property disputes. But the grand, sweeping decree to bury the first floors of the city simply does not exist in the form it should. Furthermore, we must consider the timeline. The Great Flood occurred in 1867. Yet architectural autopsies of the buried storefronts reveal a disturbing chronological anomaly. Many of the buildings that possess these perfectly preserved buried first floors were constructed in the 1870s, the 1880s, and even the 1890s. Why would a property owner, knowing that the city was in the middle of a massive, agonizing project to raise the street level, purposefully build a beautiful, ornate first-floor storefront, complete with expensive glass windows and carved wooden doors, only to immediately let the city bury it under 15 feet of dirt? It makes absolutely no economic or architectural sense. If the raising of the city was a coordinated reaction to the flood of 1867, the buildings constructed 20 years later should have simply been built on the new, higher grade. Instead, we find buildings from the late 19th century sitting deep in the earth, their beautiful ground-level entrances staring blindly into solid dirt. It suggests that the burial of the city did not happen in the immediate, logical aftermath of the flood. It suggests a process that was hidden, chaotic, and executed with a speed that defied standard architectural planning. Imagine the sheer dystopian nightmare of living in Chattanooga during this alleged transition. The official story claims that the process took decades, happening slowly, block by block. This means that for 20 or 30 years, the downtown district would have been an unlivable, jagged landscape of artificial cliffs. One street might be raised 15 feet, while the cross street remained at the original level. Wagons would not be able to navigate the sheer drops. The economy would have ground to a complete halt. We are told that pedestrians navigated this nightmare by walking on wooden planks suspended between the newly raised roads and the second stories of the buildings. The original first floors sat in deep, dark trenches below. Yet, this was the era when photography was becoming widely accessible. Photographers were obsessively documenting the growth of the American South. If Chattanooga was operating as a multi-level, wooden-planked, half-buried labyrinth for 3 decades, it would have been one of the most visually stunning and bizarre spectacles in the world. Where are the photographs? There are a few scattered, grainy images of muddy streets and elevated wooden sidewalks, but nothing that truly captures the apocalyptic scale of completely burying dozens of massive, multi-story commercial blocks. The visual record is shockingly sparse for a project that would have fundamentally dominated the daily life of every single citizen for a generation. It is this absence of evidence, the missing ledgers, the lack of a master blueprint, the strange scarcity of photographs that makes the underground city feel less like a municipal engineering project and more like a hastily covered-up secret. When utility workers break into these spaces today, they do not find the messy, chaotic remnants of a long, slow transition. They find spaces that look as though they were abandoned in a single afternoon. They find windows with the glass still perfectly intact. If a city is filling a street with heavy rocks and dirt, the pressure would instantly shatter fragile 19th-century window panes. To protect the glass, the windows would have to be meticulously bricked over or boarded up with thick lumber before the dirt was poured. Yet, in many of the subterranean rooms under Chattanooga, the delicate glass remains, staring out into the dark void between the building facade and the heavy brick retaining walls that hold back the street above. They find doors with the hardware still attached. They find painted signs advertising dry goods and apothecaries. They find iron hitching posts standing tall in the subterranean gloom. It looks like an entire architectural layer was simply sealed off and forgotten. The mystery deepens when we look at how the subterranean spaces were utilized after the burial. The official narrative suggests that these original first floors simply became basements. They were used for coal storage, boiler rooms, and mundane urban infrastructure. But the physical evidence tells a much darker, much more complex story. When the street level was artificially raised, it created a massive, interconnected labyrinth of underground tunnels, sealed rooms, and hidden corridors beneath the city. And nature abhors a vacuum. Where there is empty, unseen space, human activity will inevitably fill it. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the respectable city operated in the sunlight above, a shadow economy thrived in the buried city below. The underground became a haven for everything the polite society of the Gilded Age wished to hide. The forgotten first floors were repurposed. Walls were knocked through, connecting the basements of disparate buildings. Entire subterranean thoroughfares were created, completely invisible to the police and the politicians walking on the pavement 15 feet higher. During the era of Prohibition, the buried city was a godsend for the illicit liquor trade. Speakeasies operated in the grand, vaulted rooms that used to be street-level banks and hotels. The subterranean network allowed smugglers to move vast quantities of alcohol beneath the city without ever seeing the light of day. A raid on a surface-level business would often yield nothing because the true inventory and the true patrons were sitting comfortably in the damp, brick-lined rooms below the earth. There are local legends, supported by fragmentary police reports from the era, of underground gambling dens, hidden brothels, and secret societies holding their meetings in the buried architecture. The police were largely powerless to stop it. The underground was a maze. A raid could easily end in disaster, with officers lost in a pitch-black labyrinth, while the suspects simply slipped through a hidden door into an adjacent, forgotten storefront. But the underground was not just a playground for criminals. It was also a refuge for the desperate. Destitute families, vagrants, and men, broken by the rapidly industrializing world, sought shelter in the subterranean dark. They lived in the abandoned storefronts. They existed entirely outside the margins of society, living like ghosts in the architectural graveyard of the old city. The city above knew they were down there, but the efforts were largely symbolic. It was easier to simply ignore the problem. Out of sight, out of mind. The physical layer of dirt separating the two cities also acted as a psychological barrier, allowing the prosperous citizens of the new, elevated Chattanooga to forget the desperate souls living in the ruins of the old one. As the 20th century progressed, the memory of the underground began to fade. The generations that had witnessed the great raising died away. The speakeasies closed, the vagrants moved on or succumbed to the cold. The subterranean spaces were bricked up, divided, and largely abandoned even by the building owners. The city above paved over its past, layer by layer, until the original street level was nothing more than a myth. It is a terrifying testament to the power of collective amnesia. How is it possible for a society to completely forget the foundational architecture of its own city? It happens because history is written by the survivors, and history is physically constructed by those with the power to pour the concrete. The authorities in Chattanooga did not want to be known as a city defined by a catastrophic flood. They did not want to be known as a city sitting in a vulnerable, dangerous valley. They wanted to project strength, modernity, and permanence. So they engineered a new reality. They built a new floor and commanded everyone to stand on it. And within 2 generations, the sheer psychological weight of that new reality crushed the memory of the old one. When a child is born in a city, they assume the street they learn to walk on is the earth. When a historian reads a ledger, they assume the ledger contains the whole truth. We are programmed to accept the world as it is presented to us. The idea that we are walking on the roofs of forgotten buildings is too deeply unsettling to dwell upon. It disrupts our sense of grounding. It makes us question the solidity of our own lives. The underground city of Chattanooga forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. If an entire municipal infrastructure, dozens of massive brick buildings, cobblestone streets, and the daily lives of thousands of people can be buried, sealed, and erased from the collective memory in less than a century, what else are we walking on top of? What other histories have been quietly covered up with a few feet of dirt and a fresh layer of asphalt? The official historical narrative demands clean lines. It demands logical progression. The Great Flood happened, the city reacted, the dirt was poured, and progress marched forward. That is the story written in the brochures. That is the story taught in the local schools. But the physical evidence does not care about the official narrative. The physical evidence is sitting in the dark, waiting for a utility worker's pickaxe to break through the brick. The perfectly preserved glass windows, the unaccounted for millions of tons of earth, the buildings constructed 20 years after the flood that still found themselves buried alive. These anomalies refuse to fit into the neat, packaged timeline. They suggest a level of chaos, deception, and panic that the history books are terrified to admit. They suggest that the raising of the city was not a unified, heroic triumph of engineering. They suggest it was a desperate, piecemeal, and deeply fractured cover-up, a frantic attempt to literally bury a problem that could not be solved. Today, you can still find the physical scars of this cover-up if you know where to look. As you walk down Market Street or Broad Street, pay attention to the architecture at the ground level. Look at the heavy iron grates set into the sidewalks. Stand over them and peer down into the darkness. You are not looking into a drainage ditch. You are looking down at the roof of the old world. Look at the basements of the historic hotels and banks. Notice how the massive support columns seem to sink into the floor without a proper base. Notice how the brick arches in the cellars do not support the weight of the building above, but instead seem to have been hastily constructed to hold back the weight of the street outside. The old city is still there. It is trapped in a state of suspended animation, a perfectly preserved architectural corpse, lying in state beneath the rumble of the modern world. The men who ordered the dirt poured, the laborers who shoveled it, and the property owners who locked their wooden doors for the last time are all gone. They took the exact unvarnished truth of how and why the burial happened to their graves. They left behind a labyrinth of silence, heavily guarded by millions of tons of compacted earth. We will never know the full story. The municipal ledgers are too vague, the timeline is too broken, and the physical effort required to excavate the entire downtown is financially impossible. The buried city will remain buried. It leaves us standing on the pavement, staring down at our feet, separated by a mere 12 feet of dirt from a reality we cannot fully comprehend. We trust the ground. We trust the official record. We assume that the history we are told is the history that happened. But what if the history we are told is just the history that was built on top of the truth? What if the timeline we accept is just a layer of administrative asphalt poured over a past that was too strange, too chaotic, or too terrifying to leave in the light of day? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the burial of Chattanooga was exactly what the official brochures claim, a logical, albeit poorly documented, response to a natural disaster. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents, a chaotic era of rapid expansion where record-keeping was a luxury the city could not afford, and the bizarre architectural anomalies are just the scars of messy progress. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe they looked at the rising waters, the shifting earth, and the terrifying vulnerability of their world, and they realized that the only way to survive the future was to completely, permanently, and violently bury the past.